Have you ever done something and then thought, why did I do that? It doesn't even feel like me. Or have you ever had that moment when one part of you wanted to scream, while another begged for calm? Maybe you're struggling with something you don't even know the name of, but Freud did. Called it the id, ego, and superego. What if I told you that your mind is an invisible battlefield, where these three forces are constantly dueling? Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, was an Austrian physician born in 1856 who forever changed the way we understand the human mind. Before him, mental disorders were seen as weaknesses of character or even demonic possessions. Freud said, no, there's something deeper, something that acts behind the curtains of consciousness. He was the one who dared to claim that our conscious thoughts are just the tip of an iceberg. The greater part of our mind is submerged. Freud not only created psychoanalysis, but also divided our psyche into three fundamental forces: ID, the instinct; ego, the balance; superego, morality. But what does this mean in practice? And how does it affect our choices, our vices, our existential crises, even today? The id, the instinct, the impulse, the I want. Imagine a newborn baby. It cries when it's hungry. It screams when it's cold. It doesn't think. It feels. That's the essence of the id, the primitive side of the mind. The id knows no limits, ethics, or logic. It only wants immediate pleasure. It's your instinctive side, driven by desires like hunger, sex, aggression. You're on a diet. But you walk past a bakery and the smell invades your brain. The id screams, eat. Now. You deserve it. The id has no patience. It wants gratification now, even if it harms you later. The superego, the inner judge, morality, the you can't. If the id is the devil on your shoulder, the superego is the angel. It begins to form in childhood, with the education from parents, school, religion, society. It represents rules, ethics, values. The superego says, that's wrong. You should feel guilty for thinking that. You need to be a better person. You see a wallet on the floor full of money. The id says, take it. No one saw. The superego replies, no. That's stealing. You know what's right. The superego protects, but it can be cruel. It can suffocate, causing excessive guilt and anxiety. Very rigid people who have difficulty allowing themselves things often have a dominant superego. The ego, the mediator, the conscious I. In the middle of this conflict is the ego. Not ego as in arrogance, but rather as the rational, conscious part that tries to balance the desires of the id and the demands of the superego. The ego is the internal diplomat. It asks, how can I satisfy the id without breaking the superego's rules? How can I survive without being a slave to instincts and not a martyr to morality? You are tired and want to skip work, id. But you know you need to keep your job, superego. The ego negotiates. I'll call saying I'll arrive an hour late. That way I get some rest and maintain my responsibility. The ego is creative. It uses defense mechanisms like denial, rationalization, and sublimation to maintain balance. We live in a world where the id is more stimulated than ever. With a click, we can order food, watch pornography, buy anything. Everything is for now. Every app, every interface, every design is designed to give you quick pleasure, effortlessly, without waiting. And this reinforces the id's behavior: immediate, impulsive, voracious. Social media also feeds the id: likes, dopamine, instant pleasure. A new notification, social validation, a funny video, sensory reward. All of this activates the brain's reward system, promoting a vicious cycle. But we also live under an avalanche of judgments. Social media, religions, aesthetic standards, everything feeds the superego. You're not good enough. You should be like this. You have to win. Unattainable models of success and beauty are imposed 24 hours a day, and the superego absorbs this as the norm. The result? Millions of people live in an internal war between desire and guilt, between impulse and repression. While the id says, eat whatever you want, the superego replies, but you'll gain weight. While the id says, post this now, the superego warns, what if they judge you? While the id wants pleasure, the superego wants perfection. In the midst of all this, the ego is overloaded. The ego tries to mediate the desires of the id with the demands of the superego, but it often collapses. And when the ego can no longer balance this, symptoms arise: anxiety, depression, eating disorders, compulsions, identity crises. Freud didn't create magical solutions, but he offered a powerful lens to understand what's moving us inside. Our culture today alternates between two extremes: a culture of pleasure, which stimulates consumption, hedonism, immediate gratification, excessive products, services, and entertainment, and a culture of performance, which demands productivity, perfection, constant overcoming, work while they sleep, wake up at 5 a.m., be your best version. These cultures activate the id and the superego, respectively. Both in excess make us sick. Excessive id turns you into a compulsive being, a slave to your own desires. You can't stop eating, buying, watching, consuming, but you're never satisfied. Excessive superego imprisons you in unattainable standards. Nothing is ever enough. You live with guilt, shame, a sense of failure, even when you're doing well. The modern ego tries to cope with all of this, but it hasn't been trained. That's why it collapses. Freud didn't see the ego as the villain. On the contrary, a healthy ego is one that can handle internal and external tensions, recognizing the forces of the id and the demands of the superego, but without being dominated by either. In practice, this means learning to say no to impulses, but without completely repressing yourself, being self-critical, but without paralyzing self-judgment, balancing desire and responsibility. This requires self-knowledge, self-regulation, and emotional awareness, increasingly urgent qualities today. Most of us grew up without learning how to deal with feelings, desires, or frustrations. Formal education taught us math and grammar, but it didn't teach us what to do with anger, fear, desire, shame. The result? Emotionally illiterate adults trying to regulate the id and superego with willpower or distraction alone, which never works in the long run. The ego needs training, and this is achieved through therapy, reflective writing, mindfulness practices, conscious relationships, deep reflections on who you are, what you want, and why. When the ego is weakened, it resorts to so-called defense mechanisms. Freud described several of them: denial, pretending the problem doesn't exist; projection, attributing to others what is in you; rationalization, justifying something irrational with false logic; sublimation, transforming an unacceptable desire into something socially acceptable, e.g., aggression into sports. These mechanisms are not bad in themselves. They are attempts at psychic survival, but when used in excess, they become saboteurs. Understanding the mechanisms you use is part of strengthening the ego. It's the key to getting off autopilot. Digital tools are not neutral. They shape behaviors, emotions, values. Platforms are designed to exploit the weaknesses of the id and feed a digitized and tyrannical superego. Example: infinite scrolling stimulates the id. Beauty filters reinforce an unattainable superego. Algorithms create bubbles that prevent the ego from expanding its worldview. The modern mind is being conditioned to lose autonomy. We are being trained to react, not to reflect. Freud would say, we are being dominated by unconscious forces. But now, these forces have been outsourced to machines and platforms. If you feel like you're living on an emotional tightrope, you're not alone. If you alternate between uncontrolled pleasure and paralyzing guilt, this is not weakness. It's an archetypal conflict described by Freud over 100 years ago. The good news? You can learn to know and dialogue with these forces. The id will never disappear. The superego will always be there, but the ego can grow, and as it grows, you gain more freedom to be who you really are. In the next segment, we will delve deeper into how defense mechanisms operate in your daily life and how to identify patterns that sabotage your happiness. Understanding Freud is not just studying theory, it's diving into yourself. Because deep down, we are all trying to balance the internal forces that inhabit us, and this balance is a daily construction. The first step is to recognize internal conflicts without guilt. Knowing that wanting pleasure doesn't make you weak, that feeling guilty doesn't make you inferior, and that making mistakes is part of the growing process. When desire arises, whether for food, sex, power, validation, don't immediately repress it. Observe. Ask yourself, where does this come from? What am I trying to fill? Often, the impulse hides an emotional need or an untreated pain. What are the voices inside you that say, you can't, you shouldn't, you need to? Where did these voices come from? Are they your parents? Your religion? Society? Reflect on whether these patterns still make sense in your adult life. Therapy, one of Freud's greatest legacies. Talking is liberating, and listening to yourself with help is transformative. Emotional writing, putting your conflicts on paper helps to clear your mind. Meditation and mindfulness, practices that strengthen the ego by increasing presence and awareness. Don't deny. Don't run away. If you notice that you are projecting, rationalizing, or sabotaging yourself, don't blame yourself. Just recognize it. Self-knowledge begins with honesty. Being with people who help you reflect and not just react is fundamental. Mature relationships help the ego grow. The Freudian journey is not about getting rid of the id or crushing the superego. It's about understanding that we are a complex system, full of desires, norms, memories, and traumas, and that despite all this, we have within us the capacity for balance. Freud doesn't offer promises of instant happiness. He invites us to courage, to look inward, to deal with discomfort, to mature emotionally. We live in an era where everything pushes us outward, towards consumption, appearance, comparison. But perhaps the greatest act of rebellion is to go the opposite way, to turn inward. And there, in the silence of your mind, between desire and morality, you can find a space of freedom. This space is called a strengthened ego, and it is where your true potential resides. If this content resonated with you, leave your comment below. Tell me, in what moments of your life do you feel the id, ego, and superego fighting inside you? And of course, subscribe to the channel, activate the bell to receive more videos like this, and share with someone who needs to reflect on their own mind. If this video made you reflect, share it. Someone close to you may need to understand that their conflicts are not signs of weakness, but of humanity. And remember, knowing yourself is the beginning of all transformation. Until the next video.